Thank you very much. I'll wait for my august colleagues to get settled and then we'll kick off. Okay, so yes, I had the great good fortune to be the Global Head of Compliance at JPMorgan Asset Management, running and accountable for the compliance program within the JPMorgan Chase network. And it was quite a roller coaster ride. Financial crisis, Lehman, LIBOR, Forex, London Well, you name it. And independent oversight was a huge part of the program in terms of significance, importance, value. And one thing that I would say that during that period, it became very clear that regulators formed a very firm view that to have good communications monitoring was not a nice to have. It was a must have. And they were going to look for it in examinations, and they were going to look for evidence of it. And they even got much more ambitious about what it should be capable of achieving. That our communications monitoring should be capable not only of detecting things that have gone wrong, but also being preventative, perhaps through behavioral analysis. So things have changed hugely, and we're going to look at what communications monitoring has been, the changes, what RegTech has actually contributed to that. And we're also going to look at the challenges that RegTech has to, or those shaping programs using RegTech have to bear in mind, because obviously the more you appreciate what barriers you have to stay within, the more you can do that and the more that you can use it to your advantage. So I've got a panel of very experienced people with different perspectives to give their input on this, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Then I'm going to ask a couple of questions because it's after lunch and I want to make sure that everybody's with us. And then but it's a reminder that you can ask questions whenever you want or make comments. It's a nice small group, and that's one of the advantages of having this sort of setup. Okay, so over to my panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi there, thanks Elaine. My name is Bronwyn Boyle and I work with a company named Theta. We are a digital communications compliance provider and we use artificial intelligence and machine learning to help alleviate the burden of monitoring all types of digital communications, be that audio, video, conference recording, etc. I think we're very keen to help enable businesses to adopt new types of digital communications, and particularly video. So we're supporting them in overseeing the billions of minutes of content that are incrementing all the time, and to make sure that they're meeting obligations from regulators across the world in that respect. In terms of my background, I have over 20 years experience working in technology, starting with working for the Big Four back in Dublin. Predominantly in systems design, development and implementation. I then went on to move into security and came over to the UK about 12 years ago and spent several years working with Barclays as a Director of Information Risk Management there. And for the last few years I've been working as an independent consultant, advising a broad range of clients from leading high street banks to new startups on their cybersecurity, information risk and compliance programs. And I'm working with Theta to help support their client and partner compliance programs in the UK and also in Europe.
Great, thanks Bronwyn. Paul?
Hi, Paul Clulow, Phillips. I'm responsible globally at SocGen for surveillance and markets, so I cover markets advisory and the surveillance operation within the investment bank. I've been engaged in compliance for 20 plus years. I've been engaged in surveillance probably for the last 10 or so, running surveillance programs at BNP Paribas, Barclays. So there's a link there, which I wasn't aware of, and latterly at SG. I think in the time I've been within compliance, surveillance as a concept and as a function has changed hugely. I think it's fair to say that when I started, it was always seen as the quiet bunch of guys in the room that didn't really say much. It was a very dull subject. I'm slightly biased now, but my view is surveillance is quite a sexy subject. And that's primarily, I think, down to RegTech and what we can achieve now with the technology that's available. And obviously, we'll talk about that later today.
Thank you. So over to Justin.
Hi, I'm Justin Nathan. I'm the Chief Technical Officer for Surveillance at Credit Suisse. What that means is that I get involved in the implementation of new surveillance, refining what we've got existing, acting as dealing with the vendors as well for the new tech that's coming our way, acting as a bridge between compliance and IT, which is a bridge that's often needed. In terms of my history in the industry, I've been doing surveillance since 2003. When I started at London Stock Exchange and moved to another exchange, Swiss Exchange. They've got a store here today. I've also worked for some of the biggest investment banks and also commodity trading companies. So I've really seen surveillance done in a number of different ways across a healthy set of asset classes, and also been privileged to see the growth in technology all the way through to today.
Great. So to set the scene, I'm going to ask you perhaps some obvious questions. But those of you representing firms, how many of those firms are actively considering changes to your monitoring system? Either generally or of electronic communications, audio communications, which we're focusing on.
I'll go first.
Right. Paul's self-declaring. Right. Actually, that's a smaller number than at the back as well. Smaller number than I expected.
That's the key question.
Sorry?
Key question is what types of firms, because
For sure, yes.
we are the tech providers as opposed to the tech consumers.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. So let's do that one then. So how many people in the room are from the provider side as opposed to the user side? I would say we've got a pretty good split. Second question is, how many of those firms who are users see RegTech as a way of achieving efficiencies, changes, which effectively will allow them to do more with less? Do you see this area as something where you actually will make improvements in the way that you do things, but you will also do it at less cost? Yeah. I thought that...
You haven't got a job if you don't.
I'm more interested in what they've got to say.
Yeah, I think in today's environment, that's incredibly important. And although the phrase doing more with less is not new, I do think that this is an area where the automation and the innovation actually does give us an opportunity to restructure how we do and what we do in a way that actually uses people's time more effectively and makes people's jobs, if you like, more value add in many cases. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking at, and I'm going to throw it open to the panel, what monitoring perhaps used to look like and what it's starting to look like and what we think the benefits already are of using RegTech. So this is on the positive side of the equation.
Shall I start as the one with the most grey hair? Yeah.
Go on.
I think the thing to remember about the communication surveillance space is it's actually pretty new. Yeah. Really, communication surveillance came about as a result of the various benchmark settlements that happened back at the beginning of the decade. And I think that was the first time we'd seen regulators really delving into communications and publishing those communications as part of what were, at the time, the biggest settlements we'd ever seen in the industry, which I think made the industry sit up and take notice and realise quite what a resource, well, one, what a resource those communications were in terms of understanding what's going on within the business, and two, actually what a risk they were if we weren't in some way controlling those communications. So back then, I think it's fair to say not many organisations, definitely not the ones that I'd seen, had anything on the communication side to begin with. So we started with a bunch of random sampling, which is obviously not a terribly efficient or useful way to look at communications. I think that the industry swiftly moved into electronic communications, written communications, and lexicon-based surveillance. Which is where a lot of firms still are now. I think there's still a significant amount of lexicon-based surveillance around within the industry. What's happening now? I think again we're seeing these surveillance platforms evolve. Lexicon-based surveillance still exists, but we're now looking at natural language processing as a way to look for context in communications. There's been a huge leap forward also in terms of audio surveillance. We've got a long way to go on that front, but in terms of voice recognition, transcription, surveillance, big changes there. And then there's a lot of things to come. Yeah, so I think machine learning is going to be hugely important in this area moving forward. As I say, lots to do on the audio side in terms of language recognition, really making sense of the noise. So one more actual point, I think, which has been recognised, and not just in the communication surveillance areas, is that historically we've looked at surveillance as just, well, in my view, leading surveillance. We had a tool over here that did one thing, we had a tool over there that did another thing, we had another one over here. And we needed all of these different tools because one was particularly good in one area or one asset class, another was particularly good in another. Same has been the case with e-coms, ACOMs. I think now, at least at the bigger banks, we're now looking at surveillance as an ecosystem and looking at open architecture. And how we can move more quickly in this space. Historically, if you wanted to upgrade your surveillance system, it took you 2 years to decommission everything and rebuild everything. That's not really a viable place to be moving forward. So that's another big change.
Yeah, the history and the evolution of communication surveillance. Okay, fine. Well, I was like at the birth of it, really, and I recall not so fondly having to don the headphones and listen to hours and hours of calls and log them on a spreadsheet. For what purpose, I still struggle to think. Nothing ever really came of it other than our ability to say that we'd done it. Then we progressed with a very, very small p to the land of lexicons, where lists of words were drawn up in the hope that somebody somewhere would say them, and bingo, there we go. We've found somebody who's committed market abuse. But that too resulted in, it became more burdensome because there were many, many more alerts that came out, and they all needed to be reviewed. And I'd imagine that the escalation rate in terms of what was an interesting case was pretty similar to those before it conducting their surveillance on spreadsheets. Things have got more sophisticated. Companies have woken up or seen that there's a space for them to fill and to solve a problem that the industry is facing. However, we still are very, very much attached to lexicon-based surveillance. And we will do things like go through the communications of cases that have been found and put those words into the lexicon, because of course those words are going to come up again. I'm yet to be convinced by communication surveillance as it is right now, where we are right now. And that's mainly because I've got a much stronger belief in trade surveillance, almost like a Thatcherite type of approach, in terms of I'm more interested in what people are doing than what they're saying. We've become very interested in what people are saying, because what people are saying is what captured the imagination on the papers on the way home, in the Standard, in the Tube, because everyone can read, well, most people can read, so they can read the communication and basically try to decipher whether there's an issue in that. I still think, going back to the benchmarks and the libels that you mentioned, that had the trade surveillance been as it should be, and noticed the deviations or the differences that existed between what was being reported versus what was being traded versus what was being submitted, that would have led to those communications. The most recent evolution and the scariest evolution in relation to communication surveillance that I've seen, however, is that the communication team, because they didn't really get much joy in the market abuse space, they found themselves identifying people who are sending emails to home, so they've become the de facto information security team, and more recently than that, they've got obsessed in relation to identifying fellow colleagues who swear. Because swearing is a clear indicator of market abuse.
No, let me come in here because it's actually a perfect segue. We, the compliance population and also regulators, and perhaps it's because I'm from the asset management side particularly, have always regarded any monitoring as a means of picking up whatever your key risks are. And market abuse is one of the key risks, but it's not the only risk. And now regulators expect your monitoring and your communications monitoring to assist in finding out whether or not people are complying with policies, and effectively see surveillance as a way of changing behaviours. It is a conduct tool and not just a market abuse tool. I mean, the two aren't separated because, of course, people who perpetrate market offences are obviously not acting in the right way. But there is a broader reach, which is what I was alluding to in saying that regulators are very ambitious for this, and they expect us to be ambitious for this. But I do agree, we've got to decide what our risks are and how we're going about them. Bronwyn?
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. I mean, there's such a broad spectrum of legislation, regulation, and kind of expectations, both regulatory and also organisational, that can be supported through appropriate monitoring. And again, I think that is quite a challenge for compliance teams. It seems like the drivers are increasing all the time, but as you rightly say, it's do more with less. The budgets aren't necessarily increasing in lockstep with those demands. And I think that's where a solution that can provide a mechanism to kind of identify which policies you need to monitor for, and can also support timely interventions and kind of workflow to kind of help navigate the actions that compliance folks should take, can help alleviate some of that additional burden. But yes, it's a very broad spectrum. I mean, elements such as GDPR are kind of a vital component, as well as the more kind of financially oriented regulation.
Yeah, so it's a very broad area that we're talking about. Paul, any thoughts to pull that together?
Well, I disagree with him. So I don't know if he's a Thatcherite. I don't know what that makes me. I wouldn't necessarily put myself on the left of the equation generally. But I mean, for me, communication surveillance as a compliance officer, as you said, Elaine, it gives us access to a whole new range of risks, which, quite frankly, you never had access to before. Yeah, as a compliance advisor, as a compliance surveillance officer, it gives you new insight into what is actually truly going on the desk, rather than necessarily what the desk wants to tell you is going on. Whether in a markets context, obviously, we also cover a much broader population. So I think in terms of, as you say, conduct has been a significant drive in the UK, less elsewhere. But yet we do find ourselves looking at all manner of swear words, and which is quite amusing. We have a bad language lexicon, which, as you can imagine, was one of the best fun to pull together. But again, you're using that information as an indicator. I think we're going to talk in a minute around the ethics of all of this and some of the considerations. And clearly, what is not the right way forward is you start coming to people's desks with a plastic bag and telling them to get out the minute they say the F word. But it can be, where swearing is used excessively, an indicator. And there are numerous other indicators that exist in communication, because communication is vast and diverse, and it's what we all do every day. So there's a lot of information to be found therein, and we can do that with these tools.
In fact, there was a speech by Andrew Bailey just a few days ago talking about the FCA's business plan, and he reiterated without any apology that internal matters, how people behave internally, is relevant to the regulator, because culture and conduct is doing the right thing, which makes it sound easier than it is. And if you behave in a certain way internally to your firm, then it could be an indicator of the fact that you're prepared to deal in a way which isn't the best way for your clients and other stakeholders. So, you know, it's just always on the lips of the regulators. Question? Can we have a microphone, please?
Yeah.
No,
It's coming.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. My name is Rick. I'm a consultant with Synagon, and I'm actually working at a client on wrapping up their MiFID monitoring side. So my question to you is based on a challenge that we have is, okay, if you want to monitor for acting in the best interest of the client, which I hear now is also a broader topic, and you're still very much in a lexicon-based world, how are you coping with those challenges, or how do you see that RegTech can aid in that, in alleviating that pain?
That's a good question.
Did you want to go?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I think this is again where innovations in RegTech can be a very useful overlay to existing tools and technologies in this space. So obviously some of the restrictions of lexicon-based approaches can be addressed through a better use of RegTech. So again, for example, if you've got that ability, as Paul was referring to apply machine learning to put more contextual awareness around not just kind of what might be said, but also if there's written communications or other strands of communications that could all be relevant, pulling that together, being able to assess it again against kind of your areas of risk. I think that's probably where RegTech can really augment the current capabilities as they stand today. But I'd be keen to get Paul's view.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think the direct answer to your question, how are we coping, is not very well. Yes, I mean, we're coping by hiring lots and lots of surveillance analysts and having them wade through a lot of stuff that isn't particularly relevant. And that's why the future developments in this space are key. The natural language processing is a first step, absolutely. You need that context. One word can mean multiple different things in different contexts, and you need to try and have a tool that understands that and weeds that out rather than doing it manually. Languages are a huge issue, especially in it's relatively easy to deal with in the written space, but very, very difficult to deal with in the voice space, especially when you have more than one language in the same conversation. We're an international business, an international industry, so that's difficult. And as you say, machine learning really is, in my view, in this space. I see this as being one of the primary usages for machine learning, to really try and gain that understanding and minimize the amount that you have humans focusing on. Yeah, there'll still be a huge amount of human focus here, no matter how good the machines get, because communication is incredibly subjective. But I think definitely that's why most of the big banks are trying to move away from that lexicon-based approach and to these new approaches.
We've been picking up that theme. We've been moving to looking at typical and atypical behaviours. And I think, monitoring needs to match what you're trying to find. And over the last couple of years, global regulators have asked us increasingly to look at what they intriguingly called subtle trends, to try to identify, for example, whether or not one particular type of client was being favoured over others, whether or not there were conflicts of interest risks that we were or weren't picking up, and that we could only detect through actually looking at a lot of different scenarios and determining what appeared to be a good scenario and what might raise questions, and then looking at those ones that might raise questions. So I think that the surveillance has to actually fit the type of thing that you're trying to catch. But unless you actually know what a normal behaviour is, you don't stand a very good chance of actually identifying the atypical. So unless we get to the stage, and we might get there with the right algo of looking at everything and having enough resource to actually look at the output from that, then that still means that you've got to be able to have a means of identifying the atypical that might indicate that there is unfairness or something else inappropriate. Justin, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the communication surveillance needs a just general rethink in relation to what the risks are, because we are frittering from having said, oh, we're here to look at identify market abuse, to we're interested in what people are sending out the organisation, to now swearing, for example, and be feeling indignant when we're seeing other people swear on their communications, all the whilst while we're conducting the analysis, heavily swearing ourselves in most cases. So the interesting elements that I've seen, interesting studies that I've seen, they're pretty old studies, like Dr. Panabaker in Texas University, for example, did a study about what small words are used and what that could indicate. Personality type assessments, something that Jordan Peterson has recently, well not recently, but he's been heavily involved in to identify the aggressive nature of individuals, and when individuals on the trading desk, for example, feel under pressure, and maybe it's the pressure that would lead to them to doing something to gain an advantage on the P&L, especially if they're feeling that their back's up against the wall. That doesn't involve lexicons, and for most of the risks that current communication surveillance is looking for, a better solution is usually you can usually identify that risk sooner, faster, and more effectively via the trade.
Okay, yeah. I think that we're just trying every avenue, aren't we? But in a programme with limited resource, you do have to be very focused on what you want to achieve, what you can achieve, and what you've got the budget to achieve.
And I think that's the true answer. Yeah, the true answer is, frankly, it's not trade, it's comms, it's both, and some other things beside. Yeah, and obviously we're not here to talk about holistic surveillance and big data and the like, but that's another future development that will enhance communication surveillance as well as the other aspects of surveillance activities.
The teams as well, they're very siloed right now. You've got communication teams and trade surveillance teams, and never the two shall meet. In a lot of instances, it's key to know when to look into the communication surveillance and use the more effective surveillance as a springboard into that, especially from an analyst's perspective, rather than having two separate courses in two separate restaurants represented by comms and trade. One needs to be a side dish to the other so that they blend together, and that the analysts, because your system, however good it is, it's only ever going to be as good as your worst analyst. It needs to facilitate that level of inquisition into the data, into the comms, so it doesn't just rely on something popping up, but it allows and it gives the ability for the analysts to follow their noses too.
Yeah, so that very much supports Paul's comment about creating an ecosystem, because you can find that each different group has been hired separately and pursues its activities separately, and that's a waste. The second area that we're going to look at, thank you very much for that question, is really some of the challenges that we have faced, that providers are aware of, that we have to be mindful of. And I think that they come under the heading of the fact that regulation sometimes lags behind the speed of technology development and what we've got to look out for there. So I'm going to kick off that discussion with something that will have come up this morning in terms of GDPR. There's a lot of focus on privacy, and the rights of the individual, and making sure that the surveillance programme doesn't overstep the mark. So I'm going to ask our panellists what they think about that and what they think are pointers that you might want to consider either as a user or a provider.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that there's a slight tension, I suppose, or maybe a slight conflict even in terms of the rights of safeguarding the privacy of data subjects who are being monitored versus the onus on organisations to capture kind of more data to satisfy different regulations, and that's quite an interesting conundrum, I think, to face into. I think again the obligations to make sure that the right technical controls are being applied and that also the right level of encryption or redaction is important to make sure that you're not just generating a kind of a bigger risk elsewhere from a privacy perspective. And again, I think that's something that the right level of RegTech strategy and the right level of focus in your ecosystem can map that data through.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. What do other people think?
Well, I think the bad news is there's no easy answer on this front. I think for those of you working in the UK, you have a very specific environment to deal with. For those of you working cross-border, you'll notice that every jurisdiction has its own independent set of privacy peculiarities, let's say. Some very strong, some not so strong, but all of them really impacting in some way how you can perform communication surveillance, or not, as the case may be in a few jurisdictions. I hope there are no GDPR lawyers in the room before I say this, but GDPR is the latest buzzword, obviously, in this space. My view on GDPR is actually that is one of the easier ones. For me, there is clearly an ethical dimension to everything we do. But it is one of those regulations, I think, that allows for judgment to be used. I think if we are using, as banks, communications surveillance, banks and financial institutions, sorry, I shouldn't be specific to banks, communication surveillance to monitor for regulatory breaches, to monitor for bad behaviour, to monitor for risk to the firm. I think there is nothing in GDPR in its own right that says you can't do that. Again, there are limits to what you could do. There are limits to what you should do, and I think it's a very interesting debate as we move through this new phase of RegTech development in terms of, I think, what RegTech will allow us to do is probably going to exceed what we should do under GDPR. But I'd say GDPR, again, I think there are some GDPR lawyers out there. A number have got in the way, should I say, of development in my role and at my organisation. We have always been able to find a way through because logic says if you are doing the right thing, if you are not you're using private data, but you're using it for the right purpose as an organisation on your employees, tends not to cause an issue. So, as I say, I think for me with privacy, there are very specific laws and rules and regulations you need to apply in terms of cross-border regulation, in terms of cross-border transfer of data. We won't go into that now because we'll be here all day. Immense differences across the globe. GDPR, though, as I say, I think actually is not quite the barrier that we're often led to believe.
Which is good because other companies are developing their own GDPR. So there's California and Brazil and others. So that's going to be pretty much the standard. So although we could talk about that one for a long, long time, and it does tie to ethics, let's turn to another restriction that you have to be aware of and not necessarily apply it as a restriction. Regulators regard use of providers or use of the cloud as an outsourcing. You continue, as the user, to have the obligations that you've always had. You're just using a different means to achieve them. And so that means that you've got to factor that into your due diligence process of your providers and be prepared to have the oversight and take the accountability for what they do. And if you don't know what they do and you can't explain what they do, then that's not going to go down very well. So, Bronwyn, any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think it, obviously a lot of the regulatory compliance monitoring activities would count as critical business activities that would fall under particular scrutiny. So it's imperative that organisations have that correct due diligence in place. It's been interesting because I think one of the observations I've seen is that some of the smaller RegTech companies, particularly startups, often struggle with the due diligence processes of larger incumbent legacy organisations. Because obviously there's usually these very detailed questionnaires to fill in, quite onerous site visits, and it's quite difficult to support that when you're kind of a smaller organisation getting off the ground. Yeah. So I think there has to be some sort of an interplay in terms of how organisations are supporting startups in going through those due diligence requirements to help enable kind of a quicker route to market for them. But also obviously making sure that the right risk factors are properly mitigated and addressed from the outset. I also think as well, I think some of the startups that are looking at kind of cloud security that's based on, Amazon or Microsoft's kind of fundamentals, a lot of those are fundamentally kind of probably more secure or kind of easier to manage from an infrastructure perspective than what you would necessarily be doing internally. So there are certainly saving opportunities and efficiencies kind of coming through from that adoption.
Thank you. I think that's a very good point about the startups. It's very interesting. Anybody else want to contribute any?
I have a few less hairs on this part of my head from recent issues on this front. I think you're right, Elaine. I think regulators, in my view, do now view any software as a service installation, any outsourcing, whether it be to vendors or otherwise, as essential outsourcing. I think the problem with that is that, to my mind at least, when the European regulators drafted that rule on essential outsourcing, that wasn't what it was meant for. I think it was meant for, I'm going to send my entire operations function out to India, so here's the framework you need to have. And as Bronwyn says, I think some of the problems that arise in applying a regulation that isn't really fit for purpose to these vendor engagements it is sometimes impossible for the vendor to meet the requirements of the financial services institution that they're dealing with. And if you're a vendor with 200 clients and one of your clients is requiring you to sign a clause that says you must come to me for pre-approval for any material change to your system. Well, first, what does material mean? And second, how are you meant to run a business if you have to do that 200 times every time you want to make a change? Auditing of third-party, again, most vendors use third-party providers. Auditing of those third-party providers also causes some problems. So I think that's the big difficulty for me, is really we're trying to apply a regulation which has evolved in the regulator's mind, but hasn't evolved in terms of what's written in the rule book. So you're right, it does cause significant issues, and I can't really offer a solution other than the fact that from the financial services side, we all need to batter our legal functions to be pragmatic in this respect, and from the vendor side, I know it's frustrating, but you also have to understand where the client's coming from.
I think regulators are basically sympathetic to the fact that they don't want to stifle innovation. That wouldn't look very good on their resume, and it's actually been shown that Innovation UK is something that the FCA is very much behind with their innovation sandpit. So I think with that, with trade associations encouraging firms to leverage off each other, to see what works in terms of providing services to particular sectors, like the Investment Association and its Velocity movement. I think that they are aware that they inadvertently could be part of the problem, and they want to be seen as part of the solution. So I do think we have to sort of go back to that level, whether it's the lawyers, whether it's the regulators, to try and do the sensible thing and show that whatever we're doing is proportionate. Okay, so we're coming towards the end of the time, and just want to see if there are any questions out there or experiences. Hi, somebody's coming. Next.
Good afternoon. In terms of social content, social platforms going forward, what's the panel's view of adoption within the banking organisations that you represent?
Yes, it's a nightmare. Adoption. Look, from a surveillance perspective, what is clear is that we need to cover communications via those sorts of mediums. The real issue within a banking organisation is the sheer quantity of those sorts of mediums that are now coming into existence, some of which are very, very difficult to get at in terms of communication. Obviously, they're used heavily by individuals privately. You can't get at that. There's no, back to GDPR, there's no way of getting at that information, so there's a risk you cannot mitigate. In terms of a lot of the data is encrypted, so you have to find a way to get at that data before it gets encrypted by the social media provider. But also social media, and by that I mean sort of chat channels and chat engines. You are finding, post-MiFID, we have thousands and thousands of trading venues cropping up all around the world, and the vast majority of them offer some sort of chat functionality. So simply keeping up is very difficult in that respect. So as you say, I think businesses are adopting chat channels, social media as a real marketing tool, communication tool. We have to react to that. Again, I could give you an answer, but it will go on way past our time in terms of how you do, but it's clearly an issue for banks and financial institutions to keep up.
Yeah, but they are trying to, if you like, come to a sensible balance. Can we have a last question just before we finish, please? I think this gentleman here
I had the same question.
Okay. All right, well, I think we're out of time. Got some big zeros flashing at me here. So thank you very much for being so interested and interesting. Thank you.